You've made 100 excuses this year, and every single one of them felt true. The economy, your boss, your parents, the timing, the people who got lucky while you didn't. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Some of those excuses were real, and it didn't matter, not one bit, because out there, right now, someone with half of what you have is building the life you keep saying you can't. This is the story of a man who believed his excuses more than he believed in himself, until one old man, one sentence, and one piece of wood took every excuse he had left and turned it to sawdust. Caleb Voss grew up in a house that smelled like sawdust and varnish. His father built furniture the old way, by hand, by feel, piece by piece, in a garage that always seemed too small for what came out of it. Caleb used to sit on an overturned bucket for hours, watching his father's hands turn rough planks into something that looked like it belonged in a museum. He didn't just want to build furniture. He wanted to build a name. Voss & Co., he used to whisper to himself, tracing the letters in sawdust with his finger. A real shop, his name on the door, something that would outlast him. For a while it looked like it might happen. He apprenticed under his father through his 20s, learned every joint, every grain, every trick to make a plain piece of oak sing. He had talent, real talent, the kind that made other carpenters stop and look twice. But talent, it turns out, isn't the same as finishing. Somewhere in his 30s, the dream quietly slid from something he was building toward something he talked about. Still planning to open the shop. Still saving up. Still waiting for the right moment. The right moment never came because Caleb had gotten very good at a different kind of craftsmanship, the craftsmanship of reasons. He could build an excuse as beautifully as he built a dovetail joint. The economy was bad. The bank wouldn't lend to a guy like him. His father never left him the shop. Just debts. Every reason was true enough to survive an argument. And every reason kept him exactly where he was, in a rented garage doing odd repair jobs, telling himself that someday, when things finally lined up, he'd build the thing he was actually capable of building. You felt this too, haven't you? That specific ache of being talented and stuck at the same time, of knowing, somewhere quiet and true, that the only thing standing between you and the life you want isn't the world. It's the next excuse you haven't said yet. Every Sunday, Caleb's family gathered around a small dinner table that he'd built himself years ago. Proof, if anyone needed it, that his hands could still make something good. His wife, Rosa, would ask the same question in different clothes each week. How's the shop coming along? And Caleb would answer with a different excuse in the same tired voice. The permits are taking forever. The lumber prices are insane right now. I just need one good client to trust me with a real project, and then I can finally scale up. Rosa never argued. She just nodded. The way you nod at a story you've heard enough times to know how it ends. Their daughter, Mia, 8 years old and sharp as a tack, would sometimes ask harder questions than either of them expected. Daddy, why don't you just start? Out of the mouths of children come the sentences adults spend years avoiding. Caleb would laugh it off. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Someday you'll understand how the world actually works. Understood, even then, that he was the one who didn't understand, or maybe understood too well and hid inside that understanding like it was a blanket. Excuses are warm. They ask nothing of you. They let you keep dreaming without ever risking the dream against reality. Here's what made it worse. Every excuse he gave was, on its own, reasonable. That's the trap. Excuses don't usually feel like lies. They feel like honesty. They feel like maturity, like wisdom, like finally understanding your limits. But stacked together, day after day, year after year, they build something else entirely. A wall between the person you are and the person you keep insisting you'll become someday. Then came the Ferris job, the closest Caleb had come in years to something real. A local restaurant owner wanted 12 custom oak tables, the kind of order that could finally fund the shop he kept promising Rosa and himself. Caleb took it like a man grabbing a rope thrown into deep water. This was it. This was the moment everything had been leading to. He worked hard, genuinely hard, for the first 2 weeks. But the old patterns crept back in quietly, the way bad habits always do. Not all at once, but one excuse at a time. The wood supplier was slow, so he told himself he could push the deadline back a little. Then his tools needed sharpening, and that ate another day. Then he decided the finish wasn't quite right and started over. Telling himself perfectionism was the same thing as commitment. Every choice, taken alone, sounded responsible. Taken together, they added up to 12 days behind schedule. When Mr. Ferris called to check in, Caleb had his excuses ready like ammunition. Supply chain issues. Quality control. You want it done right, don't you? Mr. Ferris, a soft-spoken man who'd built 3 restaurants from nothing, listened patiently and then said something that stuck to Caleb's ribs. I didn't hire you for perfect. I hired you for on time. Then he canceled the order and gave it to a bigger shop across town. One with less soul, Caleb told himself, but tables on the floor by the following Friday. Caleb drove home replaying every excuse in his head, rehearsing them like a defense attorney preparing for trial. The supplier really was slow. The tools really did need sharpening. Every fact was true. And every fact was also, in its own way, a story he'd chosen to tell himself instead of a decision he'd chosen to make. Somewhere on that drive, in the quiet hum of the engine, a thought slipped through that he wasn't ready to look at directly. What if the story had always been the problem? Caleb's older brother, Nathan, ran a successful contracting business 2 towns over. He'd offered, more than once, to send Caleb steady work. Cabinetry for new builds, simple, reliable, paying jobs that could keep the lights on while the dream took shape properly. Caleb always found a reason to say no. He didn't want charity. He didn't want to build someone else's vision instead of his own. He told himself Nathan only succeeded because he married into money, because he got the easy breaks, because the world simply liked people like Nathan more than people like Caleb. The truth, which Caleb kept at arm's length, was smaller and harder to swallow. Nathan had started with less than Caleb, not more. He'd taken every job, good or beneath him, for years, while Caleb waited for a job worthy of his talent. Nathan built a reputation one small, unglamorous project at a time. Caleb built a reputation for being too good for the projects in front of him. After the Ferris job collapsed, Nathan called, gentle as always. I've got a cabinetry job lined up, 20 units, steady pay for 2 months. It's yours if you want it. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. Not gratitude, but shame wearing gratitude's clothes, curdling into resentment before it even reached his mouth. I don't need you rescuing me, Nathan. I'll figure out my own thing. Nathan went quiet on the line, the kind of quiet that comes from someone finally understanding they can't carry a person who won't let themselves be carried. That night, lying awake next to Rosa, Caleb replayed the call and told himself he'd done the right thing. Protecting his pride, protecting his vision. But pride, when it's the only thing left standing, doesn't feel like strength. It feels like the last excuse, the one dressed up nicely enough to look like a principal. The garage they used as a workshop belonged to the house, and the house belonged to the bank, and the bank had sent 3 letters that month that Caleb hadn't opened. Rosa found them stacked under a paint can while looking for a screwdriver. She didn't yell. She just sat down across from him at the table he'd built, the letters between them like a verdict already read. Caleb, we're 2 months behind. I've been picking up extra shifts at the clinic to cover it. I'm not asking you to give up the dream. I'm asking you to stop pretending the dream is happening while nothing changes. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired in a way that scared him more than anger ever could. Caleb reached for the familiar shapes of his excuses. The economy, the Ferris job falling through, bad luck stacking on bad luck. And for the first time, the words felt hollow even in his own mouth before he said them out loud. Rosa didn't need him to explain why things had gone wrong. She needed him to do something different. I need you to either get real work, steady work, starting this week, or we need to talk about whether this. She gestured at the garage, the half-finished tables, the whole quiet architecture of his unfinished dream, is something we can keep affording to believe in. Mia was asleep down the hall, and Caleb sat in the dim kitchen light long after Rosa had gone to bed, staring at his own hands, the hands his father had taught, the hands that knew how to make beautiful things and somehow never made a beautiful life. And for the first time, sitting alone in that kitchen, Caleb Voss didn't feel angry at the economy, or his father, or his luck. He felt something worse. He felt like a man who had run out of people to blame. The next morning, instead of going to the garage, Caleb walked. He didn't have a direction in mind, just a need to be somewhere his own failures weren't stacked in visible piles. He ended up near the river path at the edge of town, where he found an old man sitting on an upturned crate outside a tiny roadside stall, working a piece of driftwood with a hand plane. What caught Caleb's attention wasn't the wood. It was the man's left arm, ending just below the elbow, the sleeve of his shirt pinned neatly at the stump, and yet his right hand moved with total confidence, guiding the plane in long, even strokes, the wood curling away in pale ribbons at his feet. Caleb stood watching longer than was polite, until the old man spoke without looking up. "You gonna help? Or just admire the view?" Caleb, embarrassed, introduced himself. The old man's name was Walter. He'd been a carpenter for over 50 years, and had lost his arm in a mill accident 2 decades earlier. Caleb, feeling something between curiosity and grief, asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for years without a place to land. "How do you keep doing this? After everything?" Walter set the plane down and looked at him. Not unkindly, but directly, the way people look at you when they've earned the right to say something true. "Wood doesn't ask me if I've had a hard week, son. Wood doesn't care that I've only got one hand. It just sits there, same as it always has, waiting to become something or waiting to rot. My job's just to show up and start cutting before I talk myself out of it." Caleb opened his mouth to offer some version of his usual reasoning, and something in Walter's steady gaze made the words die before he said them. Walter held up the piece of driftwood he'd been shaping, a small, simple bowl half-formed, grain running through it like a quiet river. He turned it over once in his hand and set it in Caleb's palm. "This piece has been sitting on that beach for probably 10 years, he said. "Waiting for good weather, I suppose. Nobody ever came. Then one day I decided it didn't need good weather. It just needed me to stop waiting for some." Caleb held the half-finished bowl and felt something shift in his chest, slow and physical, like a joint finally settling into place after being wrong for years. He thought of the 12 tables he never finished on time. He thought of Nathan's steady offer, refused out of pride dressed as principal. He thought of Rose's tired voice and Mia's simple, unanswerable question, "Why don't you just start?" Every excuse he'd built over 15 years suddenly looked exactly like what it was. A very well-made reason to stay exactly where he was. "You've got good hands," Walter said, glancing at the faint scar across Caleb's knuckles. "I can tell. Question is whether you've got a good reason for not using them or just a comfortable one." Caleb didn't answer right away. The honest answer sat heavy and humiliating in his throat. "Comfortable," he finally admitted. "It's been comfortable." Walter nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer and had heard it 100 times from 100 other men standing at the same river, holding the same kind of unfinished thing. "Comfortable excuses are the most expensive kind," he said. "They don't cost you anything today. They cost you everything 10 years from now all at once." Caleb looked down at the little wooden bowl in his hands, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like arguing with the truth. He felt like doing something about it. Caleb walked home slower than he'd walked out, the little wooden bowl tucked in his jacket pocket like a stone he intended to keep. He didn't feel triumphant. Turning points rarely feel like triumph while you're inside them. They feel more like standing at the edge of something and realizing the ground has already shifted beneath your feet before you agreed to it. He thought about every version of himself that had explained away the last 15 years. The version who blamed the economy while other carpenters found clients in the same economy. The version who blamed his father's debts while never once asking Nathan how he'd built something from even less. The version who told his daughter it's not that simple while knowing, somewhere underneath the words, that it actually was that simple, just not that easy. There's a difference between simple and easy, and Caleb had spent a decade hiding inside that difference, using its complexity as a shield. Simple, start today with what you have before you feel ready. Easy, never, not for anyone, not once, not for Walter with one hand and 50 years of blisters to prove it. When he reached the garage, he didn't go inside right away. He stood in the driveway for a long moment, looking at the space that had held both his father's legacy and his own excuses in equal measure. Then he reached for the door handle, and for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he opened it not to avoid something, but to begin something. Caleb didn't clean the whole garage that day. He didn't reorganize his tools or make a 5-year plan or wait for the perfect Saturday with nothing else on the schedule. He picked up a single broken chair that had been sitting in the corner for 8 months. One leg cracked, waiting for a someday that never arrived, and he fixed it. Just that one chair. 35 minutes of actual work. The kind he'd been talking himself out of for the better part of a year. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't the shop. It wasn't Voss and Co. with his name on a real door. It was one broken chair, repaired, standing steady on 4 legs again on a Tuesday evening while his family ate dinner without him for a change. Not because he was avoiding them, but because for once he was doing the very thing he'd been telling them he was doing for years. The next day he fixed a second chair. Then a small drawer that had been sticking for months. Then he finally actually returned Nathan's call. Not to accept charity, but to ask, plainly, if the cabinetry job was still available. Nathan, to his credit, didn't gloat. He just said, "Yeah, it's yours, when can you start?" And Caleb said tomorrow and meant it. None of this looked like a breakthrough from the outside. If you'd filmed Caleb's life that week, it would have looked almost boringly ordinary. A man fixing furniture, taking calls, showing up to a job that wasn't his dream job. But something had changed underneath all of it, something invisible and total. He'd stopped waiting for the story to feel finished before he started living it. He was simply doing the next true thing in front of him. One cut, one call, one chair at a time. Weeks turned into months. Caleb worked Nathan's cabinetry job during the day, showing up early, staying reliable, letting his hands do what they'd always known how to do without wrapping it in a story about what it meant. In the evenings and on weekends, he worked in the garage, not on some distant, perfect vision, but on real orders. A neighbor's bookshelf, a friend's kitchen table. Small, unglamorous, paying work. Exactly the kind he used to consider beneath him. A year after the morning by the river, Caleb signed a lease on a small storefront 2 blocks from Nathan's contracting office. Nothing grand, just 400 square feet with good light and a solid concrete floor. He'd saved for it the unglamorous way. Steady cabinetry work, small furniture orders, months of choosing the next true thing instead of the next comfortable excuse. Standing in the doorway of his own shop, Caleb thought about all the years he'd spent explaining why it hadn't happened yet. The economy, the timing, his father's debts, other people's luck. Every excuse had been believable. Every excuse had been, in its own small way, true. And none of them had mattered, in the end, half as much as the single decision to stop waiting for a better day and start with the one already in front of him. The world will always hand you a reason good enough to stop. Your job was never to run out of excuses. It was to stop needing one.